And we will open up right now with a brief word of prayer. We come in gratitude tonight, oh God, for Ron's preliminary dig. And we come in some awe and, yes, some trepidation. For we know that we cannot bring the dead back alive, oh God, only you can. And yet you summon us to summon forth the abominations of the dead in our church's lineage, that our healing might begin, laying gently aside any and all sense of guilt that serves no one, but gently picking up and bearing the responsibility, the ability to respond, which is emancipating, which can free us. So let us, from this evening tonight, gracefully bear the responsibility forward, where responsibility had been so abandoned. From memory, hope. From Friday, Sunday. Raise the dead for us, O God. Raise us all. Amen. Welcome everyone once again to tonight, One Congregation's History, a Racial Reckoning. Ron Grimm will be making a presentation tonight, and he has about 30 slides he wants to share with us. Ron was most recently, before he retired, the curator of maps at the Boston Public Library, and was before that for many, many years was with the Library of Congress. And Ron tells me this is like a jigsaw puzzle. He's had some fun with it, but it's also very painful. We're touching on some very painful past of our church at the outbreak of the Civil War. And we are the church at Bethesda Presbyterian that named the town of Bethesda. And we'll hear what's this about the time that the Civil War broke out, or just after the town was named. But our church goes back nearly 4 centuries, and Ron's just going to touch on some of the history at the outbreak of the Civil War. And some of the history, this is a book called The Spirit of Captain John. It was official history, if you will, of our church from 1723 to 1970. It covers mostly the ministry and the ministers. Tonight, Ron's going to talk more about the membership of the church and our responsibility in terms of slavery and slaveholding at the time. So welcome, Ron. Thank you so much for this preliminary dig. I'm looking forward to your presentation tonight.
Okay, thank you, everybody. It's good to see so many people here.
And could everybody put themselves on mute while Ron makes the presentation so that we have just no background noise? Okay, thank you.
I am not getting into the slideshow.
Ron, if you go down to the bottom there, where my, yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, good. Okay, the basic question guiding the research that I've been doing the past several weeks is basically, what were the slaveholding practices of the Bethesda Presbyterian families on the eve of the Civil War? And I guess I should probably just sort of justify why I'm looking at this particular topic. Obviously, we've been discussing over the last several months and last several weeks about racial reconciliation and what that means for us as a congregation. And I think it's very appropriate that we look at this particular topic in the context of the Bethesda Presbyterian Church because we have a long history in this area, as Chuck just outlined. The church had its origins in the 1720s, and during that time, it has moved several times, and it has witnessed major events in US history. First of all, we witnessed the European colonization of native lands around the Chesapeake, then the Revolutionary War, then the Civil War, and following the Civil War, the Jim Crow and segregation eras, World War I and World War II, the latter, which was a period of great and rapid growth in this area, and finally, suburbanization and urbanization. So the church has a long history and has witnessed a lot of historical events. And I guess the other question, why focus on just the pre-Civil War years? Well, first of all, Maryland was a border state. It held slaves. There was a sizable holding of slaves, but Maryland did not secede from the Union, as was the case for Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. They were considered border states. But most historians, when they talk about Maryland's history and Montgomery County, when they talk about the history during the Civil War, they indicate it was a place where there were divided loyalties. And so I think part of our investigation will be, how did the people who are members of Bethesda Presbyterian Church how did they adapt or function within these generalizations? And just to start off, the picture that you see here is the picture of the Bethesda Meeting House, which was the site of where our congregation worshiped from about 1840 up until about 1926. This site is on Rockville Pike, north of NIH. The building still stands, and this picture was just taken a year or two ago, and you can see it is showing its age. Now, I come to this subject as a map person and as an historical geographer, and that's a pretty specialized field. I basically looked at geographical patterns in the past. My graduate research focused on Virginia in the 18th century. So this is sort of along the lines of where I've done a lot of my research. But first of all, I have two maps that I want to show you. This particular map was published in 1861, and it was based on the 1860 census. Now, in terms of maps, it's a relatively unique map because it's one of the first maps published by the US federal government to be what we call a thematic map. In other words, it takes one topic and it shows that particular subject in its various degrees of intensity. And what we see here is the percentage of slaveholding by county in the southern states. And okay, on the right-hand side, you'll see there are 9 levels of percentage. Each 10% gets a different gradation, the darkest color being the highest percentage. Now, quite often when we think about the slave South, people think of it as being solidly slave. That's not the case. There were certain areas where slavery was more concentrated than others. There were other areas where there was very little slavery. But slavery was pretty much confined to the areas where there was plantation agriculture. In the Tidewater, Maryland, and Virginia, it was tobacco. In South Carolina, along the coast, rice and indigo. In the interior, along the Piedmont, and extending into Georgia and across into Alabama and Mississippi, cotton. And along the Mississippi, the lower Mississippi was sugar, the Mississippi was cotton, as was Texas and Arkansas. And then Kentucky and Missouri had tobacco. And okay, let me go to okay, now I know you can't see the detail too well, but so we're going to look a little more closely. And so here you see one inset, the one on the, okay, the one on the left shows the slave percentages in Virginia and Maryland. You'll notice that in the interior, in what became West Virginia, there is very low percentage of slave holding. And this resulted in that part of Virginia dropping off, becoming a separate state and joining the Union, I think in 1862 or 63 as West Virginia. But as you look at the slave percentages, you see they're fairly heavy in Tidewater, which is where the tobacco cultivation began. They get heavier in the Piedmont, and by the time you get to the Shenandoah Mountains, the Appalachian Ridge, it drops off because in the valley and beyond, it was small farms basically being managed by individual families. Now, again, another detail, just showing, focusing on the Washington, D.C. area, you get a sense of the slave holdings in our particular area. Montgomery County has, in this, according to this number, had about 32% of its population as slave. Now notice how that compares to some of the adjoining counties. Howard County is a little lower. Loudoun, Fairfax, and Prince William are about the same. Prince George's and Anne Arundel are greater, as is Charles County, and also over here in Virginia. So you can see that, oops, didn't mean to go yet. Tobacco was initially a major crop in the first part of the 19th century in Montgomery County. But as the soils became depleted, agriculture switched to wheat and corn, where slavery was less efficient. So the percentages start to drop off as you move further inland. Now, one other map, and this map is sort of what I guess spurred me on this particular topic. This is a land ownership map for Montgomery County for 1865. Now, a type of map that became very popular in the 1850s and the 1860s were what were called county land ownership maps. And they showed the names of individual landowners. And they were produced to sort of sell to the landowner class. So here we see Montgomery. Okay, this particular company, Simon Martinet, produced land ownership maps for most counties in Maryland. And I think most of the other counties were done in the 1850s, but the Montgomery County one was not published until 1865. And so the big question in my mind is, how current was the information on this particular map? Was the surveyor actually collecting information during the Civil War, or is this something he had sitting around for a couple of years and he came out with the information at the close of the war? I don't have an answer to that, but that's one of the questions that intrigues me as a map person. But here you see the county. It is divided into 5 election districts, and each one has a name. We are going to focus on this one at the bottom, or which would be the southwest part of the county. It's known as Rockville, or District Number 4. And the district extends the whole way from the DC line out to Gaithersburg and Darnestown, and it includes Rockville. Now, the area that is circled in red is the area that eventually becomes Bethesda. And this is the area that I'm going to focus on as I talk about some of my further research. But you'll notice also that there are insets of the major towns along the edges, and there's one of Rockville, which looks like it's very detailed in telling who the landowners were in Rockville in 1865. Now, just to give you a sense of why this map has caught my attention, and I've known about this map for many years. At one point, I was involved in helping to compile a book at the Library of Congress called The African American Mosaic. And I was tasked with locating maps that help to illustrate the African American experience in this country. And this map is one that I identified. But here you can see a detail from the Sandy Spring area. And you'll notice that in the areas where I have circled the names, there is the abbreviation after the name of COLD, which means they are identifying those people as colored or free African American people. And you see there is quite a concentration in the Sandy Spring area. And part of this is due to the Sandy Spring Meeting House, the Quakers, who were very favorable to assisting the freed slaves. And notice right here in this circle, it says Colored Church. And I'm pretty sure that church still exists. I forget its name, but it is an important part of that community. And just another detail showing the area around Rockville. And you'll notice that there are several people identified with the letters COLD. Now this area is intriguing. There's COLD. I don't know if it applies to Mary Sage. I don't think so. I think Mary Sage applies to this little square right here. So I think what they're describing are these series of houses right here. Each little black square represents a house or a residence. And so I think they're saying that this was the home of free blacks. I don't know yet. I hope to be able to investigate that some more. Now, using the 1860 census, here are the overall population statistics for Montgomery County. I'm going to give you 3 levels of statistics. First of all, we're going to look at Montgomery County by itself as an entity. Then I will focus on just District 4. And then finally, I will focus on the Bethesda congregation. So here we see that in 1860, Montgomery County had a total population of 18,322. Of that, 11,349 were white, 1,552 were free black, and 5,421 were slave. And that, using those mathematics, that's how they got the number for the map that we just looked at. Although there's slight discrepancies in the numbers when I do the calculations, but it's still about 30% of the population was slave. Now, how do we get this information? Okay, we've just gone through the 2020 census here in our country, but every 10 years, the US government conducts a census of the population. And the reason for the census, this is how we determine the representation for each state in Congress. But in order to compile, to get these numbers, somebody has to go around and count the people. So in 1860, there were 2 types of census schedules. The first one you'll see over here lists what they call the free inhabitants. That means the free whites and the free blacks. And we have a fairly detailed listing. You don't have to look too closely at this point. I'm going to get another slide that has some, it's an enlargement, and you can see it a little more closely. But each time you see little numbers over here, this means a new household. And then you have the head of household, you have his occupation, and then it lists the members of the household. Now, the people that I have circled here are members of Bethesda Presbyterian Church in our time period. Okay, the one thing that's not on this schedule is the number of slaves. The slaves are recorded in a separate schedule, which is entitled Slave Inhabitants. And what you have here, you have the name of the owner. Then it lists, it doesn't list the names, but here it lists for each slave, it does a number indicating there's one person, the age, the sex, and then the color, whether they are black or whether they are mulatto. Now, why did they count the slaves separately? Remember back to the Constitution where slaves counted as 3/5 of a person? So in many ways, I find this a very dehumanizing schedule. First of all, there are no names. We don't know the people. And when they get counted, they're only going to be 3/5 of a person. So in a sense, there was a lot of bias already in the census schedule itself. But that's, again, reflecting the times. Now, looking at these a little more closely so that maybe you can read them. Over here on the free inhabitant side, I have some names of people that were living in Rockville. Starting with these numbers right here, that's the head of the household. I think it's Garrett Almany. And it says he was a hotel keeper. And if I look at the map for 1865, his hotel is there. And according to church records, he was a member of the Rockville church that was part of the charge that we were in at that time. So here, this is a Presbyterian at that time. Then it lists the members of his family, their age. He's 42, his wife's 39, and then the sex, female, male. And then this column says color. If they're white, they don't indicate anything. If they are black, they put a B. If they're mulatto, they put an M. So, okay, you see this guy is a hotel keeper, and then one of his, I guess this is be one of his hired hands down here, it's a different last name, is a hostler, which I think was the person taking care of the horses. Then we have another household starting here, and the head of the household is Margaret Warren, 40 years, I think, female, mulatto. And we see that her occupation is servant. Now, I'm assuming that Margaret Warren and the people in her household live next to the hotel, and they may have been working for the hotel. That's an assumption. I don't know for sure. But you'll see 2 people are listed as servants, 2 as washwomen, another one as an ostler, another, I guess, the horse handler, and here's a farm hand. You can see the first several are mulatto, the next ones are black. So we've learned a good bit about, we know a little bit about these people, I would say. We know names, we know ages, and we know a little bit about their occupation. But now over on the slave inhabitant schedule, okay, here's Samuel Perry. And we're going to talk about Samuel Perry later. He was a member of Bethesda Presbyterian. He was the head of household. He's a white man. And these listed after his name are the slaves that he owned. You can see that the oldest one was 75 years old. And then the next is 55, and it goes down in descending order. And there are a fair number of younger people, which I assume are the major workers on the plantation. Now, I went through the slave schedule for district number 4, and I counted the number of slaves for each household. And here you see the breakdown. There were 46 households who had 1 slave. And then you just see the numbers, in a sense, descending. In other words, the more slaves held, the less number of households that held that many slaves. However, you notice over here in the 15 to 20, there are quite a few, there's still a few households. And then there are 6 households that own over 21 slaves. And I have enumerated them. So I'm naming names here. Samuel Perry, Greenberry Watkins, and you'll see the little asterisk after their name indicates they were a member of the Bethesda church. And then there's several other people. Now, the last person on the list, George Peter, I have a question mark because one page of the census schedule was missing, and I've heard he owned 100 slaves. Apparently, he was a military hero from the War of 1812, and he was a politician. I'd probably say in some ways he was the George Washington of Montgomery County, a prominent politician and landowner with a large number of slaves. He apparently lived north of Rockville, near Darnestown, but he has a son who eventually lives in Rockville, and by the 1870s moves down to the Bethesda area and was living on land that eventually became NIH. Okay, now I wanted to try to figure out how many households held slaves. So look at this statistic over here where I say entire district. Okay, there were 632 households in district number 4. 197 held slaves, or 31% were slave owners. Now, I did these other numbers because I just wanted to see if there would be any difference in numbers if you looked at just Rockville or if you looked at just the rural area. And you can see that there was a higher percentage of slave owners in Rockville. Now, that surprised me. I sort of expected in an urban area it would be a lower percentage. But I think it was Lavinia and June Beale who owned quite a few slaves. I think they had their main home in Rockville, and that may have skewed the numbers. Now, looking at, trying to figure out what is the average number of slaves per household. In the entire district, there were 1,364 slaves. Again, I said there were 197 households owning slaves, which means there was an average of about 7 slaves per household. So we have an average of 7, a mean of 5. In other words, if you range all the slave holdings from 1 to 80, the middle number is 5. But you can see the range there is from 1 to 80. So there was quite a bit of difference in slaveholding, although quite a few were small slaveholders. Now, the next question, that was one way I was able to identify who owned slaves and how many. And you saw the calculations there. Now, the next question is how to determine who were church members. And fortunately, we still have a few records. They're kept in a steel box in a storeroom behind the sanctuary. And I must say, I was very fortunate that Debbie left me in and left me to my desires to go through all these documents. Well, the first thing that the first book we have, which is on the left, is called the Church Register. From 1840 to 1890, the Bethesda Church, which is the one that was on Rockville Pike, was joined together with a Presbyterian church in Rockville. So they had the same minister. And the records for both churches or both congregations were kept in the same book. So if I'm trying to just talk about our Bethesda congregation, I had to try to sort who was a Rockville member and who was a Bethesda member. And so I took lots of notes and I did a lot of sorting, and I think I figured it out. But the register tells me who the ministers were, who the elders were, who the trustees were, and then it lists the people who were confirmed or members of the church and when they were confirmed. The other document that's on the right is a typescript, and it was compiled by the Chevy Chase chapter of the DAR in the 1920s, I believe it is. And I'm not sure where they got the information because I don't think I saw that in the church register. But they list by year the marriages, the baptisms, and the funerals, and they list the names of the people. So using these two sources, I could come up with names of people. And then by associating with the names on the map, I could basically figure out which people belong to the Bethesda church, the one on Rockville Pike. Then, as we indicated, there were two histories written about the church. The one we've already mentioned is the one by Eugene and Edith Clark, published in 1970, called The Spirit of Captain John. And then there was an earlier one done in 1881 by Reverend Park Flournoy. He was the minister in the last part of the 19th century, the early 20th century. Now, both of these histories will tell you the names of the families that were active in the church during this time period, but they only give the last name. They don't give the first name. And some names were very common, like councilman. There are 3 councilman families in the area. Spates, S-P-A-T-S. There are 3 Spates families in the area. So it takes a little sorting to figure out which ones were members, because if they were all members, I don't think they would have fit in the church. It was, the church wasn't that big. Okay, now just a short overview of the history of the church. As we indicated, okay, some of you may recognize this. The image here on the left is a framed item down in Fellowship Hall. And the other item is part of a stained glass window in the sanctuary where it recounts the history of the church. 1723 is when we think it was found, when the congregation was founded. And it was located about 6 miles south of Rockville, southwest of Rockville, in the what's now the Potomac area. In 1820, they built a mission church on Rockville Pike, the site that we've been talking about. 1840, the Rockville and the Bethesda churches joined together in one charge. 1850, the Bethesda building burns down and it's replaced. 1871 is when the post office is named after the church. 1890, Bethesda and Rockville separate. 1926 is the year that the building we are now in at the corner of Wilson and Clarendon stands. And then you can see in 1942, the sanctuary was enlarged. So those are some of the important dates in the history of the church. Now, okay, as I said, the Clark book focuses on the ministers, and I just want to tell you about 3 of the ministers, particularly the ones that were serving in the 1850s and the 1860s. So here we see Randolph Smith, who later changed his last name to Delaney, and I don't think there's any good explanation at this point why he changed his name. But he served from 1847 to 1852. It was during his time period that they purchased the land for the parsonage, which stood right next to the Bethesda Meeting House on Rockville Pike. 1850, the meeting house burns. They rebuild it, and then they build the parsonage. And then, as I understand, I think Randolph Smith went to New Orleans for a while. I forget the rest of his history. Next minister, William T. Eva, served from 1852 to 1857. And apparently this was a time of growth for the church. There was a note indicating that in the second year, 40 members were added. Now I assume that means for both the Rockville and the Bethesda churches. But he left in 1857 because he was becoming very sensitive to the North-South schism over slavery. His sympathies were with the North, and I think it's the Clark book that says many members were in favor of the South. So we can start to get a sense that there were probably divided loyalties in the church. Then, okay, Edward H. Compton, who served from 1859 to 1874. And for the Bethesda Historical Society folks attending tonight, we credit him with this as the person advocating that the name of the local post office be changed to Bethesda from Darcy's store. And it's from that date in 1871 that we measure we date the birth of our community. Okay, according to the 1860 census, Compton had one female servant, white, age 20, and one male Black slave, age 24. But now he's just one person. Now, as part of my task in trying to determine who were members, I've compared the names in the church records to the Martinet map, and I have circled everybody's name. And you can see that most of the people I've identified live within a couple-mile radius. The church is the blue circle right here. Oops. It faces, okay, here's Rockville Pike coming up here. And then here's Old Georgetown Road. Here's the heart of Bethesda today. You'll see it's labeled Darcy's Store Post Office. This is 1865. It's not until 1871 that the name changes. Also, here is Wilson's Lane. So our current church would be right about where the D is in Darcy. Okay, what more can I? Okay, so you see the names of all the landowners, and I've circled the ones that I think were church members. So it's relatively compact area. Now, I've listed the names of those people, and I have, using the census materials, I have determined if they owned slaves or not, and how many each one owned. So here you see the list going from 0 up to 33. Now I'll talk a little bit about some of these. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just some overall statistics. Okay, in the numbers I calculated, there are 25 households or families. I may be off by a few, but I think these are the people who seem to be active in the church in this time period. 11 of them own no slaves, 14 own slaves. So that's a percent, 56% of the families own slaves. Compare this to the percentage for the entire district, which was 30%. So we have a slightly higher percentage. Also note, when you add together all the slaves, there were 112. That means there was an average of 8 per slaveholding family. Again, slightly higher than the average for the district. Now, just a few examples of church members. James Madison Gingell, and I will appreciate if some of the longtime members will correct me on that pronunciation. I wasn't quite sure how to pronounce that. But in the 1860 census, we learn he was a farmer. He was age 41, and I love his wife's name, Artemisia. They had 5 children, 1 to 9, and they had no slaves or servants. In the church records, we see their list that James Madison and his wife were listed as becoming communicants in 1860 and 61. Their children were baptized in 1860. and they are buried in the church cemetery. And here you can see the monument for the Gingell family. It's one that's still legible, and you can read Artemisia's name on there. I was pleased to find that. Now, where did the Gingells live? They lived in the area that was right near the intersection of Rockville Pike and Old Georgetown Road. So right here in the heart of Bethesda is where they had their farm. Next family, Thomas Renshaw. In the 1860 census, he's listed as age 34, but he's still in his father's household. I think it was William Renshaw, and he's listed as a farm laborer. His father had no slaves, but his brother Henry owned one. He becomes a church communicant in 1860. He married Anna M. Spates, who was a communicant in 1856. Now, I mentioned the Spates family because there are several Spates families, and apparently they had a lot of daughters. And these daughters got married to the Renshaws and the Huddlestons, and it looks like it was a very intermarried family. The Renshaws were buried in the cemetery in 1903, 1913. And they were located along Old Georgetown Road, north of where Cedar Lane intersects. Okay, those two represent non-slave owners. Now we go to the slave owners. Samuel Perry lived on right across the Rockville Pike from the meeting house. In 1860, he's listed as a farmer, age 59. His wife was apparently deceased, and there were 2 grown children living with him, and he owned 22 slaves. We see, according to the church records, he was elected a trustee in 1860. The funeral for Mrs. Perry was 1855. There were family baptisms in the 1850, and then there was a funeral for him in 1870. Now, according to local history, and this is repeated in the Spirit of Captain John book, they say Samuel Perry was a strong Union man. Now, this sort of seems like a contradiction to me, but I don't have an answer for that. But there's this story that on one of the Confederate raids into Montgomery County, as the Confederate soldiers were coming south on Rockville Pike, he stood out on the pike and confronted them and basically said, "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." And they apparently captured him and marched him up to Rockville at gunpoint, but eventually he was released. So to me, Samuel Perry is just an interesting personality. And it's a shame we don't know more about him. Okay, he's located on the map right across from the meeting house, and the house still stands. Its address today is Enfield Road, but this is what you would see if you're walking along Rockville Pike and can peer through all the trees. The center portion of the house is apparently what was standing in the 1850s. The wings were added later on. Another major slave owner was Robert P. Dunlap. 1860 census, he's listed as a farmer and a judge, and he was age 65. No wife, no children listed. I think I read someplace he was a bachelor, but he owned 15 slaves. He became a communicant in 1856. He signed the deed for the acreage in 1850. His house is located east of Rockville Pike along the Jones Bridge Road, and it was called Hayes Manor. And it's preserved today as part of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which I just learned about, but I couldn't get any closer to the property than this fence. The house is right back here behind the trees, and it's a gated, fenced community. And our third example is Greenberry Watkins. 1860 census lists him as a farmer, age 52, wife's deceased, he has 4 children. His household includes 1 governess, 1 farm manager, and 33 slaves. He became a communicant in 1854, an elder from 1857 to 1861. Other family members joined the church in 1850s and 60s. His second marriage was in 1861. From other histories, we learned that he was an important community leader, and he was involved in public works and improvement projects, and I think was on the one of the directors for the C&O Canal. He was a delegate to the Maryland House in 1874. And it appears that he owned land between the Rockville Pike and Brookville Road, which is basically where East-West Highway runs today. Now, this is the house that his son owned, and I don't think it's the one that he did, but this was just pictured in the Bethesda Historical Society. So it was the closest thing I had to a picture for that particular family. I also just learned that Greenberry Watkins and another farmer had their own burial ground for their slaves, and that was on Brookville Road. I think it's still preserved. At least I see it on one of the cemetery maps. So one of my days, that'll be my next walk. Okay, so one of the questions that came to my mind, okay, we now know how many people how many families owned slaves, and we have an idea of how many were owned and what the averages were. But in my mind is how many of the slaves or free blacks were included in the church ministries. And those church registers give us a hint, but I don't think it's a strong hint. Okay, from 1845 to 49, there were 17 marriages. 7 of those are indicated as colored. Baptisms, 36, 8 were colored. And you can see for 1850 to 54, 3 of the marriages were colored, 7 of the baptisms were colored. 1850, 1860, it looks like there was much less involvement, only 1 colored marriage and 1 servant marriage. And in the list of communicants, they would list the name, and if a person who was joining the church was colored, they indicated that in parentheses. So you can see there were 2, no date, 3 for 1819. I don't think they would have been living by the time I was interested in, but 1856, there were 2, 1864, 1863, 2. And the other thing I would like to point out, in the National Register of Historic Places, there's a nomination form which was prepared for the meeting house, and it was describing the architecture of the church. And they indicate upon entering the vestibule of the church, above them is a slave gallery. I have not seen any indication in the church records of this, but it would suggest that there was a place in the church for slaves to be seated if they came to the services. And my sort of final question, were slaves or freedmen buried in the cemetery? Now, if you look at the funerals as they were listed in the church register, there are no colored funerals, 1845 to 49, none from 1850 to 54, and only 1 from 1855 to 1860. So it doesn't seem like funerals were conducted at the church for the slaves. And there are some cemetery records, but none of the names mentioned in the cemetery records indicate that they were colored or slave or free blacks. And this is where I would again add, I now know that Greenberry Watkins had his own slave cemetery. That's just one of the thoughts in my mind. Are there possibly slaves buried in our cemetery? I don't know. I don't have an answer. Okay, this brings me to the end of my research. I have basically presented you with names and numbers. And as my friend Andy Reynolds suggested to me those are white names and black numbers. And I guess I would say, what did we learn tonight? We learned, at least besides all the detail I've mentioned, we've learned that more than half of the church members owned slaves, including the minister. And we also learned that the slaveholding averages and percentages were slightly larger than local averages. So we had the church had an average of 8 slaves per slaveholding family as opposed to 7, and 50% of the slaveholders, or 56% of the church families were slaveholders rather than 31% of the households for the whole district. And we also learned that several of the church members are among the largest slave owners in the District 4 area. And I would say there appears to be minimal evidence that the slaves were involved in the church ministries. So I end this. Okay, what's next? For me, I think I'm going to continue my research some. I'd like to see what the 1850 census says, what the 1870 census says, and I've learned that there's an 1867 slave census, which actually mentions the names of the slaves as they were being emancipated. So I'd like to try to find out what happened to the slaves following emancipation. And I think for we as a church, for Bethesda Presbyterian Church, I think this opens the door for discussions about reparations, whatever that might be. And I want you to notice that the picture I chose here is one of the stained glass windows, which is the one that recognizes a church history. But look at the image above the history. There is Jesus healing a person supposedly by the pool of Bethesda. And that seems to be one of the names that we in Bethesda have prided ourselves on as a place of healing and a place of mercy. So if there's a lesson for us here, maybe we can use this as a point of healing. So questions, comments, if you have specific questions about the history that I've done, I'll be glad to try to address them.
Ron, if you could drop the slide so that we can see one another, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead. Somebody's.
I'm Stephanie Rigaud with the Bethesda Historical Society, and I've done quite a lot of research regarding my own neighborhood, which is in Kensington, Rock Creek Hills, which had a number of slaves owned by the Carrolls and then the Brents and then the Rays. But in doing that research, I have gone broader and found, in particular, for example, that Samuel Perry's family merged with the Bower family. I'm not know if I pronounced that right. Bohrer, which were on the corner of Cedar and Rockville Pike, and we have a picture of the slave quarters that were there that are now in the Naval Hospital. But I also know that I have found the records of Bethesda Presbyterian from the beginning, the handwritten minutes of every meeting, like who was kicked out, who had done what. It's on maybe the LDS family history site, and I just didn't know if you had already gone through that or not, because I know that I have looked at it in some detail trying to find things relevant for us in Bethesda and for me in my Kensington research.
I think it'd be good if we touch base on that. I'm not, that might be what the DAR list was derived from. The only handwritten thing I have is the church register. So I'd like
to. These are pretty detailed meeting minutes of literally everything. I think it starts in like 1803 maybe. And I know I saw reference to various what they called colored members becoming, I forgot what the word was when they were not allowed. kicked out or allowed back, come into good graces, whatever you had to do. But it is online and I've seen it. So I will touch base with you. I just want to let you know that I've seen those resources and the resources about the Bower family on Cedar Lane, who I know is involved in the church as well.
Okay, I would also add about the Bowers that you're talking about. The wife, okay, the man's name was J. Lewis Bower. His wife was the daughter of Samuel Perry. And they lived
yes, they came together
right
and they moved to my neighborhood.
Okay. Evelyn, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Did you consult the Presbyterian Historical Society records in Philadelphia?
No, I haven't. As I said, I just started this several weeks ago, and I've been working with what I have here.
Well, it's a beautiful, beautiful repository. I have no idea, you know, what all they have, but it would sound to me like they might have old minute books that the Latter-day Saints may have copied or something like that. I don't know. It's worth calling them and telling them what you're doing.
Okay.
And you, Ron, if you call them and tell them you're from the Bethesda Presbyterian Church in Bethesda, Maryland, they can look up for you and tell you what they have, if anything.
Okay, that sounds good. There was a question in the chat, where did I find the maps? Both maps are available at the Library of Congress in the Geography of Map Division. We also had the slave map, the slave percentages map at the Boston Public Library. So they're both digital images online at both of those websites.
Just want to mention that Ruth, who asked that question, I'll just go ahead and say Ruth is a co-pastor, Ruth Hamilton, with her husband Brian at Westminster Presbyterian, a truly interracial church down in DC, about 50-50 black-white. And Ruth and I and others have talked about different churches in the Presbytery, National Capital Presbytery, doing research like this. And Ron is starting to, setting the tone here and finding out how the land that we now sit on and where that land, who was original owners, if you will, the white owners of the land, if that's connected to slaveholding in any way. And that's a big, big question that we're just trying to find the right questions to ask right now.
One other comment, sorry, this is Stephanie again, very quickly. I do know that George Peter and his son Armistead Peter were related to the Peters in Georgetown who owned Tudor Place, who were married into the Custis family, George Washington's wife's family. So there's a lot of interrelationship there.
Yeah, I think I read that as well. So yes, that's a good point.
Ron, I'm just stunned and so grateful for the depth and perseverance of all your research and your careful presentation. I'm seeing this is recorded because I've realized that the histories that you're offering to us are so important, so unknown in a specific sense, known of course broadly, but for us to get information that there were 112 slaves owned by members of our congregation at a particular point in time brings a specificity to our reflections about where we stand in this issue that's really powerful, at least for me. And I'm just feeling grateful for your work. And as my mother-in-law, Doris, commented, who's been watching with me, saying how sobering this is.
Yes.
So thank you for your work.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, I noticed one comment to me about the Clark book. The title of the book is The Spirit of Captain John. And I quite often translate that into Cabin John. I guess back in the 1600s, when John Smith sailed up the Potomac and came near the Falls of the Potomac, they thought he named this stream the Captain John Stream, but eventually it became known as the Cabin John. So when I'm talking, I just sort of meld the two together, and I apologize for not being more specific.
Okay. And that's why it's Kevin.
I really also appreciate so much learning so much about this history. And it's ironic to me that when I was serving at Bethesda Presbyterian, which was from 1983 to 1991, we were addressing still the fallout of the years of the civil rights movement and the impact it had on the congregation at that time. And I had no idea that these issues of North and South and the enslavement of people, the treatment of Black and Brown people was so much a part of the life of the congregation for such a long period of time. And so it's really sobering, and it's also very interesting to recognize that continued in the DNA of the congregation into the time when I served there. So I just really appreciate being part of tonight and hearing more specificity on a history that I wasn't aware of while I served at Bethesda.
I think you raised a point there that I don't think we want to forget, is that in the 60s, the church was very much involved in the civil rights movement. And we don't want to forget that part of our history either.
Well, and it was also something that really divided the congregation and caused a major schism. I had not realized that there had been a previous, or at least one, I don't know if there were more over the years, but to hear that that was a schism and that there was a pastor who left because of that, which was kind of in some ways to me, a repeat of the history at the time of Carl Pritchett, who was a pastor at Bethesda for 25 years, and he was the previous pastor to the pastor I served with. So anyway, I don't mean to get us off track, but there are just so many things that I really was very grateful. And I mean, it's not a history that I'm grateful was part of the church, but it certainly was enlightening tonight. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hey, Ron, could your co-host now, could you leave in the chat your email address or some contact information? I'm imagining that there might be people on this Zoom who may wish to contact you, or do you want me to put it there?
I'll try. See if I. Maybe you should do it. If you'll be.
Okay.
Now, I've been told that the Friends School was a former estate, and I don't know whether that's beyond the time frame that we're looking at in this study or not. But I think Connie Nelson was the one that told me that they owned all the land around, not just where the Friends School is, but a lot of the land around. And so I'm thinking they might have also owned the land where our church is now, and somehow or other just gave it to the church or sold it. I don't know the specifics.
Okay, I haven't investigated it totally, but I know the subdivision Edgemore was started in the 1910s, which would have included the land, which basically includes where our church is today, plus where the Sidwell Friends is. So that was previously a farm, but it got purchased, I think, by the Tuckermans, and they developed that into what was Edgemore. So if go ahead.
There's a whole book about Edgemoor that was just published not long ago. I think Wendy, Stephanie, you probably know, and just a year or two ago. And anyway, that's all I wanted to interject.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, if the land our church is located on was, okay, it was farmland, I'm pretty sure of that. I wouldn't doubt that. But whether that land was owned by people who have slaves, I didn't get that deep into this yet.
I'd be stunned if it wasn't. And one thing I think, unfortunately, you'll find, and one thing I have found in my research, that the number of slaves in Montgomery County dropped dramatically in the census from 1850 to 1860. And I don't know the reason for that, if it had to do with financial factors, agricultural factors. So I think it's going to be even worse than the numbers we know now. And that's why I'm kind of curious about what you said about the change from tobacco to wheat being less efficient to have slaves, or maybe as development happened, farms got smaller. But I do know that some of the people who are the founders of Bethesda, who had, for example, 60 enslaved persons in 1850, might have had 4 in 1860. So something happened in that 10 years. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that's an interesting subject of research.
I suspect it's the changing agriculture. But that's one of the things I hope to do, is look at the 1850 and see how the numbers compare.
Yeah, not only for Montgomery County to compare the numbers, but also in the other areas, like in PG County and stuff like that, because part of it might be influenced with the Civil War approaching, that people didn't want to declare slaves where they would declare them before.
Okay, anyone else? I know we're going past the hour a little bit. I do want to respect the time and people's time, but we do have most of the people who join in, we have about 3/4 of 4/5 of them still here. And if there are any more questions to ask.
Chuck, I just wanted to check to see whether.
I'd like to welcome my friend Pauline Lerner to the meeting. I invited her in and to the meeting. I'm very glad you're able to be here, Pauline.
Welcome.
My friend Pauline Lerner.
Yes, welcome.
Thank
Pauline.
you. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Ron. It's a terrific talk.
Yes, thanks very much.
Chuck, I wanted to check to see whether it's possible that we can just go ahead and rebook Ron for about 3 months out. So we give him all of our questions and research requests. He can hop on those and then come back to us.
Hey, we might make him a paid staff of the church. Oh, what am I saying?
I had a question. I don't know if this was covered. I was out briefly.
Yeah,
Did any of the freed slaves during that time become church members?
Yes.
There are, okay, I showed that there were maybe 4 or 5 that became members by 62, 63. So after, okay, it'll be interesting to see what's happened after emancipation.
yes, and if they became elders.
My guess is they left and got their own churches after that.
Yeah.
I suspect that too.
I feel like I just had a heavy meal. And digestion is not so pleasant. But your work is, Ron, you've done us, we're deeply indebted to the presentation tonight to you. Thank you so much. And Pat, just so we were not introduced as we shared, Lynn did, thankfully. And Pat is our parish associate of our congregation, and he has begun a wonderful ministry called Interwoven Congregations, trying to match churches that predominantly people of color, predominantly white, is doing great work in that regard. And Pat, if you could close us with a word of prayer, I would be deeply indebted to you.
Let's gather together. Almighty God, as we've spent time together tonight, we have seen maps, we have seen ledgers, some with names, some with just numbers, ages, the description of a race. Yet all of this tells such an anguishing story, a story that is heavy upon our own hearts, but we know it is a story that anguishes your heart, God. So we pray that we can absorb this important information that Ron has delved into and shared with us tonight, and that it not remain simply an object of curiosity, but it become an impetus, that it would spur us further as a congregation, and other friends who are joining us this evening may spur them into further reflection about what do we do next in light of this information. So we give thanks for Ron's service and ask that you would be with us all and strengthen us all for this long journey that we are on. But Lord, that you would equip us, that you would sustain us and give us the fortitude, the perseverance, and the courage to go forward and take action so that we can discover justice in this land. In Christ Jesus we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And notice again in the chat, Ron's contact information, his email address, and you can simply cut and paste that, or however you wish. Or just send some. If you can't pick it up from the chat, you're not that tech savvy, just email me later and I'll send it to you. All right. Terrific. And we do have this on recording. It can be distributed to others. And if you would like others to see it, feel free to reach out to me and I'll make sure you get a copy. All right. God bless you, each and every one. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you all, and